So now, on that note, I wanted to talk about a few things that I think I've observed in other games or that I've observed in games that I want to work on. Again, they're definitely not things that I've always got right, but they're things that I think are really important before you start writing dialogue, before you sit down, and even before you sit down and work out your protagonist, when you're thinking about what kind of game you want to make and you're thinking about what kind of things it's communicating to the player. I wanted to go through 3 things that I think will make a massive difference. So number 1, I'm calling it the super nuke. It's an easy point to make, and reviewers make it all the time, kind of unfairly. We've all seen New York blow up too many times in games. We all save the world on a fairly regular basis. The problem with that, and it's part of a wider problem, is that the apocalypse is always going to be fresh to your character, but it's not necessarily going to be fresh to the player. The role of your story person isn't to exist in the story bubble and to ignore everything else. A really good writer can talk to you about what you're giving the player, when and how you're giving it to them. A really good writer isn't about making a story world and then pretending everything else doesn't exist. It's about being the most audience-conscious person, or one of the most audience-conscious people in the room. It's about having a sense of play, and I don't necessarily mean play in the sense of, fun and what we all do in the schoolyard. This specifically, I'm talking about play in the sense of flex or movement. If you have a sense of distance between your character, your protagonist, and your player, you can't really ultimately get over that. You can go a really, really long way. And one of the ways that you can try to do that is, instead of keeping that story bubble right there, you play with the fact that the player is aware of what's going on. How do you make blowing up New York interesting to a player? Well, consider giving them an emotional relationship with somebody who's stuck in New York. I mean, that's the choice that's kind of most familiar to us, but it really does work. The New York thing, to me, means not necessarily going for scale and scope for the sake of it. It doesn't, especially if you're working on a sequel, it doesn't necessarily give your story more impact to take it to the next level in terms of threat or jeopardy, because really good games have been made where you only worry about the immediate people around you, where you're just worried about your brother. Sometimes good games have been made where you're just worried about your brother and you're in the middle of the apocalypse. The thing to bear in mind is that escalation is not worth it on its own terms, especially if it's going to cost you money. But it can provide a really, really good canvas for an emotional journey, which is what matters. When you talk about flex and giving a sense of what the player is doing in the story, and acknowledging that the player might be feeling a little bit distant from the story, what you can do is kind of even try customizing your story a little bit based on things that your player has done. It's a thing that particularly open world games are really, really prone to. If you've got an open game that's trying to sustain a story as well, it'll give you a brilliant motivation to go to the next mission and get on with it, because it's revenge, or your friend has been kidnapped and they're being held in a really horrible situation. But then the game, of course, allows you the freedom to go off and kill a bunch of deer or do a bunch of achievements, whatever you want. When you resume the mission, the game pretends like you rushed there, because of course it's given you a strong enough motivation to do that. That pops the player right out of the immersive experience, because they know that they've been given a set of rules that they can mess with at that point. That's the point where I start to wonder if tiny bits of variation would really bring the player back into the experience. And it's as simple as exactly the same code that goes into a trophy. If you're able to say to the player, wow, you came straight here, okay, you care about this. Or if you didn't, you might assume that the player has been off training themselves. If there's a half-hour elapse, if there's 2 hours and a bunch of achievements elapse between going between 2 missions, then you might respond to the player by asking even whether they cared in the first place. That's the kind of thing that will force your player to respond, because they might, in outrage, say to their TV screen, of course I do, I was just doing something else because I didn't know you were keeping track of me. That's the moment where you bridge that gap between the player and the game, and you're not worried so much about motive as you are about finding out about your character, responding to what your character does in the world, and most important of all, having a relationship with your player and your protagonist where your protagonist changes according to the decisions the player makes, including changes how they appear to other people. It's kind of an expansion, a different point that I observe in modern games as well. This one I'm calling the broken mirror. This is a good example, an example of somebody who does it really, really well. This is in the Deus Ex remake that came out a couple of years ago. When you've just got back into Adam Jensen's body and you've got all these augmented limbs and so forth, and he's a completely different person and he's a little bit lost and you've had a big time skip, you go into his flat And if you explore a little bit further, you go into the bathroom and you find out that his mirror has been broken with kind of an obvious fist smash in the middle of it. If you go a little bit deeper, you see that there's a post-it note which says, okay, call management, I need to get another mirror. If you go and have a look at his computer, you'll find out that there's an email there that's really snippy from management saying, this is the third mirror you've broken this month. You need to stop doing this. Your mirror hasn't arrived yet. We'll send it up as soon as it's ready. If you go downstairs and hack into the management's computer, you find out that the mirror actually has arrived, and they're just holding it because they're so annoyed with this guy because he keeps breaking his mirror. It's a fantastic moment because it takes us around the back of a character who we're looking through the eyes of, but we find out something about him that nobody else knows. We find out something that somebody's lying to him. We find out that there's a lot more going on that even he is than we're aware of, even as we're playing him. And it's a really great point. David Hare makes the same point. Let's go back. David Hare makes the same point. It's another way to think about a scene and making it a lot more interesting. David Hare's a playwright and screenwriter. He says just take the bell jar off it. If you're writing a scene and it's more boring than you expect, it almost certainly is more boring than you expect. It certainly is the first draft of anything I do. You can take the bell jar off by just having one or more of the characters thinking about something else and having something in the back of their minds. If they've got a baby or a mistress waiting out in the car who's waiting for them to arrive, that's a Mad Men example that he uses. Or if they wonder if they're being lied to, or if they don't really know what's going on but they're winging it. If the player knows more about what's going on and can see a layer deeper than the conversation you're giving them, it gets the player so much more interesting. That's the source of engagement. It's really, really good and cheap way to make it a lot more interesting than it would otherwise be.